Matthew, when you attended Davos this year, you went to the World Economic Forum Board on International Trade and Investment and also joined the working group on tax and particular tax on e-commerce. What were the issues that you raised with the board?
Well, obviously the board was meeting at a fascinating time in history. We've got the tensions on trade between the US and China. We've seen the rise in populism, nationalism, and we've seen a move to unilateral action in terms of protectionist, anti-trade, anti-investment activity, as well as a move away from multilateral to more bilateral trade arrangements. So that was the backdrop. What I was asked to do was provide to the gathering, which is trade ministers and CEOs of corporates, a synopsis of what we're hearing from our clients around the challenges that brings. So the first thing I did was really share with them some of the fundamental changes which have happened both in trade and investment and which are continuing at a pace. So the first obviously was around technology. That technology is changing the products, it's also changing the way products are manufactured, with many products now integrating software into those and integrating follow-on services. The second area was services itself. Services are growing at a faster rate than the trade in goods. McKinsey said 60% faster rate in growth in services last year, according to their report. And then the third area was that we're seeing a fundamental change in demographics. So we're seeing the rise in middle-class consumers in the developing markets. At the same time, in the developed markets, we're seeing the change in the consumers with the millennials becoming more influential in their buying choices, both in terms of goods and services. And there's going to be a huge shift in wealth in the developed markets to those millennial consumers of the future, and their buying criteria are very different. They're much more focused on sustainability, for example, as one of their key criteria. So those shifts, both in terms of the developing markets and within the developed markets, are huge. Just before Davos, Bloomberg published their view of the world in 2030. It's really interesting. 7 of the top countries by GDP in 2030 are going to be today developing countries, and only 3 of the developed countries will be in that top 10 countries in 2030.
So those trade tensions, permeating the discussions at Davos, a digital economy, and actually sort of all of the things which come out of that, and particularly the growth in services versus goods. What was the reaction of the board to the various topics that you raised?
Well, two observations. One was this year the board did not have anybody attending from the US and China. So, did we have the right people in the room was, I guess, one of the questions I sort of thought about as I went into that discussion. But we did have about 15 trade ministers from around the world there, so it was a good group. We also had CEOs from businesses such as Ginny Rometty from IBM, the CEO of AP Møller-Mærsk, the CEO of UPS. So it was a good cross-section. Interestingly, I think there was a real enthusiasm for a public-private initiative and collaboration to address some of these issues. We also had in the room representatives from the big multilateral agencies, so the WTO, etc. And they were also recognizing that they need to evolve their models quickly to address those issues of technology, services, digitalization, data, etc. Instead of some of the past meetings I've been to where the discussions have been about grand plans and schemes about this, interestingly, it was much more refreshing to hear their determination to tackle some of these issues individually and to work together to understand how they could make real progress to address the challenges of those changing markets.
What were really the key themes that were developed during that dialogue, and where are those key themes taking us?
Okay, well, I think the first one was there's a real willingness to look at the challenge of data, recognizing that the free movement of data is now a fundamental part of trade and investment. And whilst there are obviously some real challenges around data privacy and confidentiality and the rights to data, there was also an opportunity for the private and public sectors to come together and develop incremental steps and plans to allow more free data movement across borders. So that was a specific initiative that came out of the meeting. Secondly, I think there was a recognition that more needs to be done around e-commerce generally, and the WTO immediately after Davos announced an initiative signed by 70 countries around reform of the rules on e-commerce, which is again was a step forward. The third element, I think, was an initiative to start to look at a global framework for tax of e-commerce and digital trade. Very much in the early days, but something that there was a lot of support on. And linked to that as a fourth element was, I think, the commitment that we heard from the Japanese trade minister and also other members of the Japanese delegation that is part of their leadership of the G20 this year. They're really going to try and push through the offices of the G20 some quite radical proposals to address both those issues of digital and technology trade, intellectual property rights, but also some other tax reforms that may look to address the sense of inequality that we've seen flow from globalization.
So trade has been something for the last couple of years which has really risen to the top of the agenda and throws up lots of complex challenges, but also opportunities. What are your conclusions? Where do you think the ambitions lie? How can those ambitions be achieved? What is the future for what does the future for trade look like?
Well, I think the first thing is everybody accepts that actually promoting global trade and investment is absolutely fundamental to addressing some of the challenges we're facing in the world today. There's a negative reaction to globalization, but actually with the connectivity across the globe, as we've talked about digital and technology, it's inevitable that global trade is going to continue to flourish, both in goods and particularly in services going forward. So it's not as though you can put the genie back in the bottle. It is going to continue. So the real issue is there an appetite to build a stronger, more robust, reformed framework in order to establish the rules for global trade and for the benefits to flow more equally across the jurisdictions. Now, there's some fundamental challenges there, particularly around technology and who is going to develop the infrastructure for that global trade and digitalized trade going forward. So that there is a risk there, as we heard about the sort of that tech war. The trade war growing into a tech war, and then that tech war exploding into something a lot worse. So there was real concern about that, but there was a real passion and commitment from people to address those challenges and bring people together on this multilateral basis. It's not without challenges, that's for sure, particularly when you look around the geopolitical landscape of the world. But there was a real appetite to try and address some of these issues on a multilateral public-private collaboration going forward.